Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, welcome to tonight's live stream, opening night of Sydney Whisky Forum 2021. Another year of sharing great whisky in front of computer screens all around Australia. My name is Scott Fitzsimons, and I look after all the whisky and spirits here at the Oak Barrel in Sydney, Australia. And normally, in the second last week of August, I would be very stressed, pulling my hair out in the last throes of organising Sydney Whisky Fair. But this is far easier because all I have to do is fire up my computer and sit around and share some whisky with some people from all around the country. And we have people jumping in from all around, all over the place. Tonight we are talking about Bimber, single malt whiskey out of London, an urban distillery, something we have a bit of experience with in Australia in the past 5-10 years with distilleries pushing into urban environments. A distillery we've been tracking for a little while, a distillery with quite a bit of an Australian hint to their operations and to their ownership. And most importantly, a distillery we had planned to make quite a big song and dance about at this year's Whisky Fair. But because we can't do that in person, we've got 5 single cask expressions to try tonight that we've sent out to people all around the country. So thank you for those who've picked up the pack. If you don't have the pack, feel free to still crack something at home. Have a dram, have a chat, because that's what we're all about for this Whisky Forum. The theme in the next couple of weeks, across the next 12 nights or so, is lifting spirits, and that's basically what we're all about. So g'day to everyone. I'd like to introduce a few people onto the stream. A familiar face first, the other Scott F in the Australian whisky industry, Scott Farrow from Wonderland Drinks, importer extraordinaire who regular Oak Barrel tasting room attendees and live streams will be familiar with, but perhaps almost certainly, Scotty, more important tonight, Matt McKay from the Bimber Distillery in the UK. Now, Matt does a lot of the sort of ambassadorial and communication works for the distillery. Also a bit of a whiskey writer and does have a certificate in distilling as well, so we might tap into a little bit of that knowledge as well. But Matt, g'day. Thank you for joining us on opening night. And how's life in London at the moment? It's been a while since I've been over there.
Hey, Scott, and hey, everyone joining us. Life in London is pretty good at the minute. Semi-normal. Certainly a British summer in that it's grey and not that warm. But yeah, we're all doing good, and absolute pleasure to be joining you for this stream tonight. And yeah, looking forward to a good evening and some great questions.
You are at a bit of a disadvantage, obviously. By my calculations, it's 35 past 10 in the morning for you.
Correct. Yep.
Whereas all us Australians have finished a hard day of work / lockdown, and we're ready to have some whiskey. So thank you for writing off your morning with us. Might jump straight into it and sort of do a quick introduction into Bimber. I know there's some people that have been knocking down my doors about when we were going to do something with Bimber who are a little bit switched on, but I know there's also some people that, this is the first time they've heard of the distillery, let alone sort of tried it. So, I mean, urban distillery in London, what's the 30-second pitch on Bimber?
Sure. So Bimber is indeed what you might term an urban distillery. The beauty lies within rather than it being without. We're based in West London, in an industrial estate. We were founded in 2015. Our heritage is Polish. It's where the name Bimber comes from. Bimber in Polish means moonshine. And that's effectively our background. Our master distiller, Darius, his father and his grandfather were Polish moonshiners in communist era Russia. So mainly distilling with fruit, but certainly distilling away from the prying eyes of the taxman, and using equipment that was pretty primitive. So, no electronics, no steam, using real fire, monitoring and developing spirit using the 5 human senses, smell, taste, touch. And what we do at Bimber in London, now legally, very much is drawn from that historical basis, from distilling using human senses, not reliant on too much machinery, no computerization in the distillery at all, trying to make the best spirits we can in London, which historically was a point of English whiskey distillation. But for 100 years, there was no one distilling whiskey in London. And we're very proud to be part of that sort of English whiskey revival and waving the flag for all Londoners around the world.
Yes, we've had some. Obviously, there's a lot of very proud Scots in Australia, very proud of Scottish whiskey, and Australian whiskey's obviously been emerging. But we're starting to see the English expats sort of rise to the top, getting a little bit louder with the proliferation of English whiskey, not only existing but starting to make its way to our shores as well. And we'll get into some more specifics about the distillery and its size, but it's fair to say you guys don't make a lot of whiskey. The 5 single casks we're going to try tonight, vary from 150 bottles to 250 bottles sort of territory. So, why Australia? Why are we so lucky?
I mean, you guys are so lucky because you have a great culture of appreciating whiskey. And Bimber is, despite our heritage being Polish, we're very much an international distillery. London is, a melting pot of cultures within the distillery itself. At one point, I was the only English-speaking native. Now we've got an Australian working for us. We've got an Italian in our sales department. We are very much wanting to be viewed as not just a London or English whiskey, but a global whiskey. We're all whiskey geeks, and we just love sharing whiskey, whether it's ours or someone else's around the world. So, you guys love your whiskey, therefore we love you, and we'd love to share it with you.
Excellent. I like that. I think it's now 10 minutes officially into Forum, and my glass is still empty. So I think while we dive into the distillery, let's pause something. If you have the kit at home, I've just quickly posted the lineup for tonight, but we're going to start with Richard number 144. So while we taste this and give a little bit of a nose, if you've done the thing which I think most people have, is you've heard about Bimber, jumped onto the website. There's a lot of talk about handcrafted and hands-on, about floor-malted barley and that sort of thing. And let's be honest, the term craft and handcrafted is quite overused. I'm pretty sure Smirnoff try and use handcrafted in some of their stuff. So what is it exactly about Bimber that sort of you play to that moniker?
Sure. So you're quite right, Scott, that the word craft doesn't really have a definition anymore. And there's been a bit of a zeitgeist, both of things which I think are true craft, but also of marketing, which just simply uses the word. We feel we can use it because of the processes that we put in place. As I alluded to earlier, there are no computers in Bimber at all. Everything is done by hand. So to just give you a very quick rundown of our process so you can understand what we're doing, which relates to why we don't have that much whiskey. Our journey begins in Hampshire, which is just west of London. There we have a single farm, Fordham and Allen, which grows all of our barley. We went around sort of 20, 25 farms in the UK to find the farm that was the right one to supply all of our barley needs. And that's not just a combination of the style of barley, but it's also a relationship. We don't have grain silos on site. We can't store tons and tons of barley. So what we need to do is have someone who can deliver to us every single. That barley is brought over to Bimber via Warminster Maltings, which is the oldest malting floor in England. We have 2 floors there dedicated to Bimber. It's traditionally floor malted, i.e. it's laid out on the floor, having been steeped and germinated. It's then turned by hand. And then things get a little bit funky. A lot of distilleries you will see over here have one of 2 mills. They have either a Porteous or a bobby mill, so a big green mill or a big red mill. We don't mill our barley at all. We simply crack it. So when the barley is delivered to us, it's specified to be cracked. Because what we want to do with it is we want to extract just the right amount of sugar. We want a clear, resulting wort to really promote those fruity flavors. So straight away when the barley arrives, it's a little bit different in terms of that processing compared to a lot of distilleries, particularly you'll see in Scotland. From there, we apply 2 waters, 2 sparge waters. Again, a little bit different. A lot of distilleries you'll see using 3 increasing temperatures. We don't choose free. We get enough extractable converted starch out of two waters. We're not about extending the yield. We're simply about getting the right raw ingredients and the right basis to make our whiskey. Fermentation is probably the most iconic thing at Bimber. We ferment in 7 American oak washbacks. If you look online, you'll no doubt see photos of these. We built those ourselves. Our on-site coopers are super talented. They constructed those for us. They are made of American oak, which is unusual. Normally, you'll find wooden washbacks are made of Oregon pine. The reason why we've selected the American oak is we actually want to impart some flavor, some aroma into our wash. It's our fundamental belief that distillation is simply reinforcing the flavors and the profile that we've created during fermentation. So to that end, those washbacks are lightly toasted. We don't clean them as well as you would clean a steel tank. We leave them a little bit dirty because what we do is we ferment over 7 days, 168 hours. And the active yeast, which is a combination of distillers and baker's yeast, that ferments for 4 days. The additional 3 days result in a malolactic fermentation, a secondary fermentation, which partly cues off of the slight inherent dirtiness of the washbacks, the bacteria in there, but also because the washbacks are open top. It's a wild yeast fermentation. And what this extra time does is it develops esters, quite a lot of fruity, high impact, sharp esters. And that's something that I think you're going to taste through all of tonight's whiskies, a bright fruitiness, which in some ways belies the age. The whiskies you're going to be drinking here are roughly 4.5 years old. They taste a lot older because of that profile. Distillation, again, is customized to alembic pot stills from Hogger in Portugal. It's direct fired. You don't see that all too often nowadays, although some people are bringing it back. I've just had a question about washbacks and infection. We've only ever had one, which is not bad going, for 5 years. Effectively, if any of you brew beer, you'll understand that while sanitation is vital, the other thing that's really important when you're fermenting is temperature. So we do keep those washbacks at a very constant temperature, around 26 degrees. And so despite running an open top, yeah, we've only had one infection over the whole time we've been distilling, touch wood. So yeah, we keep a close eye on them, but no, that's not something that we want in terms of infection, but we do want the bacteria. Distillation is by direct fire, which is quite unusual in that it means that the still has an inconsistent temperature. The bottom of the still is extremely hot. The sort of top of the still is much cooler. And what that does is similar to if you cook a steak. You get a Maillard effect, which is where you get the char lines onto your steak. Of course, you can sous vide a steak. It'll be beautifully tasty. But without that char on the outside of it, it's losing something. It's losing something textural, and it's losing something flavor. And so you get that Maillard effect in the bottom of our stills, where the direct fire touches the copper, and it actually burns on the heavier compounds that are in the wash into that still. That adds substantive weight to our spirit. Again, I think you'll taste that through the samples they have. They have texture and mouthfeel that belies their age. It's a bit of a funny process in that when we come to the actual distillation cut points, they're extremely tight. We don't redistill heads. There's virtually no tails in the mix. So it's a bit of a dichotomy in the fermentation is fruity but dirty. Distillation, we're burning on heavier compounds into that spirit. But then when it comes to the actual outputs of those two stills, double pot distillation, it's really tight, precise, and clean. And so you end up with this dichotomy spirit that has real body and real character, a little bit of dirtiness, a little bit of bite to it, but still has a clean and crisp profile. I don't know anywhere in the world that is sort of going down that route. You'll get distilleries like Old School Mortlach, where they're just going on that heavier side. You'll get a lot of new distilleries just going on the very clean and fruity side. We try to do a bit of both. None of this process that I've described to you is computerized. It is all done by hand. Coming back to your question, Scott. So all of the washbacks, it's not an automated machine where you push a button and it pumps it. We have to pump it across the distillery floor itself, which means laying a pipe across the ceiling, using a manual pump to move it into the washback, doing the same thing into the pot still. All measurements are done by hand. They're done using hydrometers, and they're done using taste. We do not distill based on computerization. We do not distill based on time. A lot of distilleries will simply say, right, 62 minutes, up to this. We don't do that at all. We measure the ABV, we smell and taste the outputs, and we decide that's exactly what we want. I'll probably talk a little bit about casks as we move through the different spirits, because that's obviously a very, very different side of how you can convert that same new make and have different flavors. But effectively, yeah, I believe we're craft because of a scale. We produce one cask a day, 50,000 liters of pure alcohol a year, which is pretty tiny when you think that some of the distilleries in Scotland are producing 100 casks a day, sort of 12 million liters of alcohol a year. And I believe we're craft because of those processes, all of which take substantially longer than a lot of distilleries. We could easily produce another 50% more spirit, but then it wouldn't have the profile that you're drinking now. It wouldn't taste like that at all. It's the effort that we've put in and the patience to wait and to leave these things to happen. Long fermentation, slow distillation. Yeah, you could put through a lot more and get more yield. It wouldn't have this profile, and therefore it wouldn't be Bimber.
It's an excellent overview of the production, and I just think it sort of like puts into perspective, just the size of it. I want to shout out to a few people. Thank you, Gerald, for that question about open top fermenting. As soon as you said open tops and wild yeast and secondary fermentation, I was guaranteed there's some natural wine and craft beer fans I know in this chat that we're going to jump into there. And a big g'day to Peter Bingle as well from the Belgrove Distillery, who also runs a direct fire still that he built himself. So I could see him getting very excited down there in Tassie. Before we get into casks, and I've got plenty of questions about that process, and obviously anyone watching, feel free to throw them in the chat as well. Let's dive into this whiskey because good
Yep.
friend of the stream and very, very acute nose. Simon McGorum has commented with a few things here. Great nose on the first dram, toasted marshmallows and red apple slices, wine gums and chewy caramel. And I have to admit, I'm going to stick my hands up here. I've had some Bimber samples, but I like doing these things fresh. I saw, recharred. I knew a little bit on paper. I thought this was going to be a bit of an oak bomb, but it's not at all. It is so luscious and so giving and so generous in its nose. When we talk about it's called a recharred cask. Is that a finish? Is that a full maturation?
So it's a full maturation. It's what you're drinking is somewhat the follow-up to our first major release. Our first ever whiskey, cunningly named Bimber the First, in case you were wondering, was released in September 2019. We followed it up with recharred Oak Cask's small batch, which was a release of 5,000 bottles. And to my mind, it's the release that put Bimber on the map. The first release only had 1,000 bottles. It was well received, but with only 1,000 bottles, only a certain number of people can hear about you. Recharred Oak Casks got a much broader audience, and I think it made people raise eyebrows. What you are drinking here is one of the leftover, deliberately longer matured single casks, the last ones we had. We might do some more of these, but actually these were a bit of a punt. These casks were very risky when we bought them. They were not necessarily in the best state for maturing whiskey. They were a little bit knackered, as one might say. So we took the decision to strip them down by hand, literally scrub them all out effectively of wire wool, And then we took a flamethrower to them, our belief being that we could effectively rejuvenate them. But as I say, it was a bit of a risk, because if we just filled the spirit into them as we received them, I think it would have been quite naff. So we tried to recover the casks to make something different. And we were staggered by the results. Quite early on, they were taking on color, they were taking on substantive flavor, but particularly from that jarring process, they were adding a lot of those, not wood, but wood sugars into that mix of fruity spirits. So from about sort of 18 months on, we felt a little bit more relaxed that these casks were going to deliver something. But it wasn't until they really got to age before actually these really are some fantastic casks in terms of having a piece of wood that other distilleries I think might write off, and that we've been able to produce. I'm not going to call it a miracle, but a bit of a phoenix from the flames. So you're trying the single cask variant, which is a cask strength, and a super popular release. We'll certainly try and do some more charring experiments in the future. But I don't know if we'll be able to replicate those exact conditions. As I described, a bit of what can we do to make these casks better? And it turned out that we did a great job there. So the source of those casks might be a bit different. But we do really like that combination of unlocked wood sugars, gentle wood char with that fruity spirit that you're getting. So I hope that you guys enjoy it. That's definitely one of my favorites.
Yeah, everything we're going through tonight is cask strength. Someone points out really well balanced for the proof. We're at 57.9. So we're not mucking around by any stretch of the imagination. But whether you believe me or not, this is my first drink of the day. And normally, that first drink, whether it's 40% or 60%, has just that little bit of heat. And I'm getting next to none of that. Now, I mean, this is a question a lot of people ask. That they talk about balance. They talk about integration with ABV and the flavor that higher ABV brings without it being hot. In your experience, is it fermentation and distillation, or is it lucking out with wood? Like, what actually makes these higher ABV whiskies integrated as opposed to some, and we've all had some where they're fall over and they're clumsy and they're hot and messy?
Tough question, Scott. I'm going to say, and I'll qualify it in a minute. I'm going to say it's a combination of all those processes. If you make poor quality spirit, it doesn't matter on the quality of your cask. It's still going to produce poor quality whiskey. Shit in, shit out, as the expression goes. So there has to be some semblance of making a good quality spirit to even give you a chance of producing something which I guess some might say, I don't like the word, but it's accurate, smooth, integrated or balanced. If you really want to boil it down, for me, it's the combination of the spirit style and its inherent profiles and its productivities to extract the wood. Let's not forget that when the spirits and the wood are interacting, it's not just about imparting a flavor. It is about cleaning up of that spirit, particularly at a younger age. There's still quite a lot of elements in there which define it as new make spirit rather than whiskey. It's not just the fact that it's that age, but in terms of its characters. So to get something which has smooth or balance or whatever, for me, it's the difference between the type of spirit and its inherent profile, weight, flavor, sharpness, entry point ABV in the barrel, as those varies, and the type of cask you put it in. You might have a spirit that has all of those characteristics, but in one cask type it appears as balanced and integrated, and there's another one it's coming out quite hot. It's a combination of all those things, and it's about being sympathetic with matching your spirit to particular wood types.
Yeah, no, excellent. And Anita smells like Babunia's cake, and Dan Packham, very, very good drop. So fruity on the nose, but has tremendous body. I think it's actually surprising me a little bit how complete this whiskey is. I want to throw to the other Scotty F very quickly, because this is often the missing piece in the chain that people who drink whiskey like myself miss. We've got the distillers and the producers who make, and the brand ambassadors that talk about that. People like myself who stand at the front line at the retail or the bar that talk about it. But someone has to stand in the middle and take a punt and spend many, many thousands of dollars on whiskey and excise to actually get it into the country. And for a band like Bimber that admittedly is very exciting, there's not a huge amount of it to sell, and therefore not a huge amount to make your millions and buy your beach house off straight away. So, Scotty, like, what is it about Bimber when this was first presented to you that sort of makes you go, okay, this is something that I can I can get around?
Yeah, I guess it's one of those things when I'm looking around at brands and trying to think not just what will go well, but also what will sit well within my business, because it's all well and good to say, well, I want to make a lot of money out of the next product that I bring into the country. But if that product doesn't fit into the size of business I am, and we can't have a great relationship, and we're not aligned in terms of who we are and what we're trying to achieve, then probably that's not going to work out. There's no point in me trying to bring on a Diageo product because I don't have the bank balance for a start to have them even talk to me, and secondly is that it probably doesn't excite me either to want to work with a big brand like that, and so when I look around the world, not just Australia, but the world, I'm looking at products that I think are exciting and innovative and are doing something within the realm of what we love, but doing it a bit differently and doing it with some excitement. And, when I saw Bimber and I sort of was looking into what they were doing, they were also getting a lot of attention. But one of the things that I think really was the attention to detail, the thing that really drew me to them. And, I try not to fall in love with products that I carry because, sometimes relationships can go bad. So you don't want to be too deeply enamored with, but I think the products that I end up falling in love with in my portfolio are the ones that have this attention to detail. And I mean, not just as soon as you look at the packaging, I mean, you want to go deeper. You want to say, oh, wow, that looks beautiful. Yeah, the attention to detail in the packaging alone is something you can tell, oh, these guys have been thinking about this. Let's delve in deeper than that. And I think just every step of the way, every touch point, excuse me, every bit of understanding that I have about the product really, it just said to me, no, this is a product that I really want to work with. And I think, tonight what Matt's explaining, and also the taste that everybody is, the proof is in the pudding at the end of the day. And I think you all are all experiencing now what I experienced the first time I started to taste some of the products, and I'm just so excited about the opportunity to work with Bimber, and also to be able to introduce some of the things that we're working on. And the future, I think, is super exciting with Bimber and what's coming down the track. I think when you look at what's happening now, it's just a precursor to what's going to be happening in the future. And when a product like this is tasting so good as it is in its early days, I mean, you can only imagine how it's going to be as it matures along down the track. So,
yeah, 100%. And one thing that I point out, and we might jump onto the second whiskey, which is the Virgin Oak Cask 140, which is actually an Australian exclusive. And there wasn't just a question where can we get a full bottle of this stuff. If you go to oakbarrel.com.au/Bimber, you'll find a few bottles, but not this next one, because this one is long gone and you can't have it. So if you do have a dram in front of you, savor what you've got tonight. But one thing that you touched on there, on Scotty, that I want to throw back to Matt is just sort of the concept of understanding here. And we're going to have another whiskey, and for all intents and purposes, it's got Bimber written on the label. The only thing difference really is that it's from a different cask, and the cask is a different number. And so we assume that the process is being the same. Now, Matt, what you were talking about is, we have an element here in Australia of the young distilleries coming up, and we talk a lot about fermentation and barley strains and that sort of stuff, which you go back 10 years and the Scotch industry is not really talking about that, but younger distilleries have to, which so I think the Australian market sort of understands that conversation, which leads me to another point. If you're doing everything by hand, no computers, no temperature points, everything is being hand measured and hand tasted, what happens if someone gets a cold? Or someone gets poached by another business? Like, how do you create that consistency, not just for this week or even between seasons, but in 3 years' time? Or is that something that you lean into and it is really, you know, the team working now, this is their production, and in 20 years' time, that's going to be their sort of hallmark?
Sure. It's a really good question, Scott. So I think there's a two-part answer to that. So in terms of what we're doing now, cask sort of assessment is done by Darius, our master distiller, and myself. That invariably involves either in the distillery or sometimes at home. I'll sit there with 80 or 100 samples, often of the same cask type. And everyone goes, wow, that sounds like the best Friday night ever. But then what they don't realize is that I'm diluting those all down to 30% ABV. So it's a common assessment without actually the alcohol interfering. And I'm sitting there with a spit bucket. So it's perhaps not as a funky Friday night as you might think. And by the end of that, let me tell you, a whiskey is the last thing I want to taste. I'll reach for a beer. It's a lot of hard work. It's a conversation between, myself, Darius, and our head distiller, Artur. We all have different palates, but effectively, it's coming up with those consistent points that we all agree on. But you touched on a very important thing that, A, if you've got a cold, well, that's not happening. Wait until, your cold's gone. B, if you've got COVID, which I certainly did in October, panic because I lost all of my sense of smell and taste for 10 days. And I thought, well, that was the end of my whiskey career. Fortunately, it did come back. That was a worry. But to the other point, Bimber is changing. And we see that as fundamental to who we are. In the whiskies that you're going to be tasting, there will be changes in the production process that have happened in those bottles, quite deliberately. We're all learning. We're all trying to make the best whiskey that we can, but our learning increases. So, for instance, those wooden washbacks, originally they were steel. Same process, open tops, temperature controlled, wild yeast, but they were steel. And so that has changed. We are not in the business to just simply be putting out a 4-year-old whiskey and saying, here you go. That's what Bimber is. Every batch that we do, every bottle that we do, over time is older. We believe that we are on a journey and that you are on a journey. We want to experience what Bimber tastes like in 7 years, 8 years, 10 years. And we want you to do that with us. So we have absolutely no qualms around playing around with our processes, trying to improve them constantly, and increasing the cask types and the cask ages as we go along. So the consistency that we're looking for is not consistency in terms of what you might think of for someone. You mentioned Diageo, so I'll go with it. Someone like Diageo, let me pick one, Talisker 10. The job of the master blender there is very skilled. It's picking from thousands of casks, batting them together to create a product that has a perennial profile that doesn't change. That is immensely skillful. On the one hand, we don't have enough casks to even consider a project like that. And on the other, as I've just said, that's not what we're about. We want to be changing. We want people to open a bottle of Bimber in 5 years' time and still be as surprised as you are today. So that consistency is much more focused around the quality and the profile rather than consistency simply meaning the same. That's not what we mean about consistency. We mean consistency in terms of it being true to the passion that we've put in and the output of the quality of the spirit, not consistency in terms of it being identical every single time. So in that sense, yeah, at the moment, there's a few of us who do the cask assessments. We make picks, we decide on the vattings. Who knows what the future will bring? But if it changes, if there's other people doing that, they bring their skills and Bimber changes with it. And I think that's a good thing. I think resting on your laurels and always producing the same thing is not being very adaptive to a marketplace, which in my view changed rapidly. If Bimber was launched 10 years ago, I don't think we'd be here having this conversation. The market has got to a position where it is open and willing to explore English whiskey, young whiskey, Bimber whiskey. 10 years ago, it wasn't. So everything changes, and we change with it.
Yeah, no, very true. And I think the access to knowledge and information is really driving that, which is fantastic. So, thanks you again for being available to us.
No problem.
On that, so the first whiskey we tried was Cask 144 Rechar. This whiskey we're trying is Cask 140 and Virgin Oak. So we're not too far away. We're 4 days away if you guys were being busy that week. What is the difference between Rechar and Virgin for people who might be looking at this?
Sure. So the primary difference is that the Virgin cask has not had any liquid in it for 4 hours. There's a common misconception that Virgin means green, that the oak is untreated, that it's just literally wood. That's a mistake. If you stick any spirit into just wood that hasn't been treated, it's going to be disgusting. It has to have had some type of toast or char applied to it. You need to break up the surface of the innards of the cask to allow that transfer between spirit wood and oxygen to even take place. So the difference here is twofold, guys. The Rechar had liquid in it before it was used. We then stripped it out and charred it again. This Virgin cask has been charred, but its contents have held nothing before. And that's fundamental. Whenever you fill a barrel, particularly for the first time, you get what's called some might call it the devil's cut. I simply just call it cask infill. And around 20 litres on a full-size barrel will just be sucked up into wood. So when that happens on a Virgin cask, all of that infill is not the precursor liquid. It's not sherry, it's not port. We're going to be trying those in a bit. It's all our spirit. And so the interactions that you're getting between lignins, the tannins, particularly the sugars and spices, are much more pronounced. So, Scott, you were talking about it being an oak bomb. This one is certainly heading more in that direction. But what I get more from it is that sort of sense of, I think Simon's mentioned on the chat, burnt. Yeah, you're going to get those burnt flavors. You're actually bringing the char into the barrel. You're going to get quite a lot more spice in my palate. Really going to bring spirit, not bring in any liquid, because this is the only liquid that's been in there.
Yeah, and just on Simon's comments there, I was expecting it to be exactly the same. I was thinking the one thing this whiskey is missing is tannin, which is a good thing. I think sometimes we pass tannin off as a flavor or a tasty note in whiskey, but really it probably shouldn't be there. How big are these barrels? Do you cooper things to a certain size, or are they varied?
They are varied. These are full. So these would be American standard barrels, so 200 liters.
Yeah.
And on tannins, for me, tannin is structure and tannin is texture. And let's be clear, it is required. Without that wood tannins, you actually don't have the whole integration. It's when tannins overpower and you end up with them stuck around your gums and they're sticky, and that's a bit of an acquired taste. And there's always a danger of that. It's why these Virgin casks, these are about 3.5 years old. And I don't think that we're going to be pushing any of the ones that we have or that we do in the future much further than that, because of that reason, because the spirit at that point is so extractive. The cask is so fresh. It's ready to give everything that it's got. You leave this spirit in that barrel for 7 years and it will be tannic. It will be overcooked and it will burn out that barrel very quickly. So the reason why it's not too tannic is because we've only matured it for the amount of time where we feel we've got the profile from it. We haven't pushed it too far. Virgin casks can be fantastic for bringing flavor. They're very, very easy to allow to go too far, particularly finishing in them. And then they bring with them the associated volume of wood, which may or may not be a desirable thing depending on your palate.
That's a fantastic point, and I think coming from Australia, and Scotty, you might agree with this. I know that both of us have shared a wine or two together in the past. We've sort of been, I think, assaulted with big South Australian Shiraz in the past 20 years, which drunk, within 3 years is over tannic, and that can be quite a negative thing. It needs 10 years in the bottle. And I think that sort of tasting note, that profile, we mentally transpose onto various whiskies. So it's interesting to hear, I've had a lot of conversations about too much tannin and that sort of stuff through the Australian taster's prism. It's fascinating to see from yours. It was actually, it's just how you manage that tannin that you need to actually not have a clumsy, flippant whiskey.
Yeah, it's almost like adding water to your whiskey. Once you've added it, it's virtually impossible to take it out. There are not many ways to reduce, looking at the comment, reduce tannins once they're there. You could try adding some smoke. That's going to hide it. It's not going to remove it. The only other way I would think of is simply vatting that whiskey with something less tannic, thereby thinning it out. But if you're just looking at one barrel to the neck, if it's got too much tannins in, there's nothing you can do to reduce that. It is what it is. So for me, the maturation effort is around careful monitoring and careful judgment, so that you don't leave it in there. We could have easily left it in there longer. To say it's not 3 years old, it's 4 years old. Big whoop. That doesn't make a difference to us. The spirit was ready. As with all bimbers, the spirit comes out the barrel when we feel it's at its best. And the virgin oak, you're not going to see Bimber virgin oak at 5, 6, 7 years of age, because it would just be too much.
Yeah. Just to sort of like pair back onto this specific whiskey, which I think as well, really carries through to the palate, and the finishes is really, really strong on this one. Again, we're at 58.1%, so not mucking around. It was an Australian exclusive, as I mentioned, and 71 bottles in total. We're collectively drinking bottle number 16. So a tiny output. Was this perhaps a split cask?
I think that one probably would have been a smaller cask. We have a variety of barrel sizes, some bigger, some smaller. The smaller ones in particular, which I think this one was, even more imperative not to leave it too long. That interaction is going to be a lot quicker.
Yeah, and just on that, because we have a lot of, again, through the prism of Australian whiskey, and you're probably getting some questions that you wouldn't normally get if you're doing a tasting for Russia or America or something. But like a lot of distilleries here through spirit at 20-litre casks just to have something ready by 2 years, and often that was too long in our climate. What is the climate in London like at the moment, and what is your warehousing like? I know the distillery itself is very small. Presumably the warehousing is somewhere else. Sure.
So we have two warehouses. We have one in the distillery, and then we have a bonded warehouse up the road. How would I describe the climate? It is both warmer and more humid than Scotland. You definitely get a heat island effect in London, but it is nowhere near the level that you guys get pretty much anywhere in Australia. We play into it. And I think it's important, if you're looking at maturing whiskey, particularly if you want to try and do it quicker, you should play into your climatic conditions, i.e. we move barrels around. So if they're in the bonded warehouse, that's generally where we send things for the long sleep. If they're in the distillery, because it's a distillery, is much warmer. The differences in temperature between the ground and the top of the rafters is quite enormous. So we, similar as you might find in a rick house in Kentucky, we deliberately manipulate cask positions within the racks, up and down, so that they're either getting much colder during the winter or much hotter during the summer. The difference being contraction and expansion through the season. So it is something that London, being south of Scotland, having that heat island effect, and being in the distillery, we're able to do. It is nowhere near the sort of climatic conditions you're going to get somewhere which, I wouldn't say you guys have tropical maturation, but it's certainly heading in those directions where you're able to mature things naturally faster because of the warmer and more humid climate.
I think here the tropical depends on the T-shirt the distillers are wearing that day in terms of the maturation. Australian exclusive, well and truly sold out. Scotty, going to throw you under the bus here. How many more Australian exclusives have we got? And will we see one for Whisky Fair 2022 when hopefully we can finally do this in the flesh again?
When you say how many have we got, you mean as in the one you've got now?
Well, if you've got, you did not let me know if I'm going to choose those numbers.
No, I was going to say you'd have to go to the auctions for that, unfortunately. But I, without revealing anything, I guess it's safe to say that I think our relationship with Bimber has got off to a good start, and we see a future together. So, yeah, watch this space.
Yeah, I think watch this space is definitely a non-spoiler answer to that one from our side as well.
Excellent news. Requests coming in from Gary, who's I believe on the west coast of Tassie at the moment. Can we please have a bourbon cask, single cask? So we'll get into that. But we don't have a bourbon cask right now. What we do have, I think, is we're going to jump into a sherry cask expression. So cask number 46. So we're actually going about 100 casks earlier to what we have been, looking at. So 315 bottles out of this one at 58.5%. So I'm going to hazard a guess and say something bigger, like a butt or a puncheon.
Yeah,
in
it's
terms
a butt.
of
Yeah.
Yeah, cool. And so, I mean, this is going back to, as I said, about 100 casks earlier. Is this, as you sort of touched on before, a different production method? As people start to nose this, is it a different spirit that went, well, not different, but slightly tweaked spirit that went into this?
Yeah, it is. So anything from sub cask 110 or thereabouts will have been made on the old steel washbacks. Same process, same yeast, 7-day ferment, open topped, but not with those American oak washbacks. It does make a difference. So effectively, we've got, roughly 100 casks, of which we've released, I think, about half of them. The rest are laying down longer, so that we've got some exciting things in the future. So probably around 50 casks that we've released in various forms that reflect that already, even after 2 years. Old Bimber. I find that quite a staggering concept. After 2 years, we can still talk about, the Bimber of old. You know, when you talk about spirit profiles, you're normally talking about a decade or two. But yeah, that change in production process happened around cask 110, and it is quite fundamental in terms of really pushing those fruity flavors. Nevertheless, in a sherry cask, you're going to get a whole lot of different fruity flavors from the precursor liquid that spirit's been matured in.
That's a really, I mean, and I've been at many great whiskey fairs and festivals, and I'll always remember the first time I went to, probably for me, the best whiskey festival show fair in the Southern Hemisphere, which is Whiskey Galore's Dram Fest. I remember the first time I went was about 6 years ago, and I was standing there in the corner and knowing a lot about whiskey, but not necessarily having been into whiskey for 30 years, and just eavesdropping on a conversation that was about Laphroaig and the differences between late 60s Laphroaig and early 60s
sure.
Laphroaig.
Yeah.
I sit there and go, like, how do people know this, and what does this mean? I was lucky enough to get into that conversation and learnt about it. But when you're talking about like the differences in the spirit, for people who maybe, you know, aren't lucky enough to work full time in whiskey and look at that, like what, and you know, we've got a big sherry cask that's fruity already. Like, what are the differences after this maturation that the spirit can still play, that they can maybe, you know, understand a little bit?
Sure. So, I mean, Simon's already touched on it in the comments, much more spirit forward. That's absolutely going to be one of them. You're going to get differences. And I'll talk generally, not just about Bimber, but in any whiskey. You're going to get differences in how distillers and blenders want the spirit to be either forwards or backwards. There are, you know, it's a bit of a great divide. As a whiskey drinker, I much prefer whiskey which is spirit forward rather than cask forward. I can equally find you other people who take the complete opposite view. Over time, those changes will manifest themselves. So I believe that our change in the washbacks has achieved two things. Number one, a much more sympathetic fermentation in the wood, thereby relaxing that spirit. Number two, it's also a difference in the profile of that spirit, how it interacts and extracts from particular barrels. Sherry, for me, is always going to be despite the sweetness, a lot sharper than some of those more creamy notes that you might expect to be from an ex-bourbon. Some of the later sherry casks, because of that more relaxed fermentation, don't show that characteristic. Sometimes it's very hard to tell, particularly if you've got a first fill barrel, how much is spirit, how much is cask. The beauty's in the eye of the beholder. But then when you start to look over, you mentioned Laphroaig. I mean, the differences in the profile there. Even if you go back to just pre-Royal Warrant, everyone thinks of Laphroaig as this massive phenolic TCP bomb. Try some of the older stuff. It wasn't always that way. And that's even more fundamental than changing one part of the process. That's generations of updates, renewals, replacements, and different mindsets of distillers. So, I talk about old Bimber and new Bimber, and that's a thing, but it's a very, very tiny thing over a small point of time. When you look at long-founded distilleries, such as Laphroaig, changes over 60 years are far more radical because of the amount of time that has passed and because of the amount of plant that has simply been replaced in that distillery.
Yeah, I think it's excellent. And, I'm certainly one of those people that doesn't always have the means to, dive into 1960s Laphroaig when I want to. So to be able to see it here manifest in one tasting is excellent. Dan Packham, again, loves the sherry cask. Demerara sugar on the nose, but not overtly cask influence. Good spirit fruities. Again, like really well balanced. It was interesting the way you were describing, Matt, the fruitiness, because I wrote down a couple of things, and tasting notes are always very personal. And when I was growing up, I used to have porridge for breakfast before school, and I used to have as much brown sugar as Mum would let me. So that very like hot, sort of brown sugar, but that quite intense sort of notes. And then on the palate, caramello koalas, which I don't know if you're familiar with, but we used to get like the really big ones you'd sell for $1 at school for fundraising for your, to buy the school a new, soccer net or something like that. Just that real like intense caramello sort of like caramel chocolatey thing on the mid palate there that I found. But as you mentioned, I'll do it a lot more overt, those notes, as opposed to the first two, which were there was a lot more going on. I couldn't pick out as many specifics, if that makes sense.
Sure, and I think another factor there is the age. I mean, this sherry cask would have been bottled a little bit after being 3 years old, 3 years, 4 months. The recharge cask probably a whole extra year older, which in the grand scheme of things, you talk about the difference between a 17-year-old and 18-year-old whiskey. But when it comes to our spirit at that age, actually a year is a massive difference. So, this being one of those younger casks, yes, there's a fundamental difference in that process that we alluded to in that change of washbacks, but also it is relatively a younger spirit when you compare it to the recharge cask, and the virgin cask is somewhat uncomparable to those two because it does so much in a short space of time. Again, it alludes back to the point I was making earlier that just trying to have lots of different things so that every time you taste a Bimber, it's a surprise. We look forward to releasing some older sherry casks. They're going to be 5.5 the next time around that we bring those out. 2 whole years older, and they are fundamentally different again.
Yeah, amazing. And I think that the final 2 whiskies we've got are both port casks, and I'd like to do them side by side if we can. But before we just jump into them quickly, we're trying single casks. And I find this fascinating to really understand the distillery and what it does in its most, natural naked form. But that's not everything that Bimber does. And, is there a core range release? Is there something on the horizon that will be, Bimber? And what does that look like?
Sure. So there isn't a core range release. There will be. As I've said, we've been bottling for less than 2 years. So, when I get people emailing me saying, why don't you have a core range? I do like to remind them that we've been bottling less than 2 years. The reasons why we don't have a core range and the reasons why we eventually will do are twofold. Number one, we need the volume of cask to be able to support it. There's no point putting out a product you describe as core if it's all sold out and no one can buy it. That's not a core release. At the moment, everything we put out sells in minutes or sometimes even seconds. So there's balancing that notion. So there's a certain volume that we need to produce, have available for a core release, which is far beyond the volumes that we're talking about here today. Then there's also the question is, well, what is it? And if it's just a vatting of bourbon casks, and I'll talk about the other things we do in a second, if it's just that, then sure, we have a lot of bourbon casks. But is that what Bimber Core is? And the answer is we don't know. So it's that balancing between having the cask broad enough to support it, but also deciding ourselves, well, what is it? And at the moment, we're not doing that. We are pushing the spirit further so that every bottling is unique, it's different, it's older. So what we do have are what we call small batch releases. We're just about to release, literally maybe tomorrow, depending on what my email looks like after this chat. Ex-bourbon batch free. It'll be our oldest and biggest release for 2 years. There'll be 5,000 bottles, 4.5 pushing 5-year-old whiskey in that batting, and that's a really important part of what we do. We've got a reputation for all these single casks, particularly as we've taken the view that we want to, as I said right at the beginning, share the Bimber love with everyone around the world. We don't have enough volume to do a vatting, a small batch release for every country. We barely have enough to do that for ourselves. So that's why there's all these different country editions and one-offs, because that's what we've got. But the small batch releases will get bigger, and they're where we show a different side. They're where we show our skills and arts as blenders of bringing different casks together, of then taking those casks and then additionally maturing them in other casks. So of really trying to take the liquid, which we fundamentally believe is good, but trying to elevate it and take it in different directions. So you've effectively got two sides of Bimber. You've got that wider batch release where we're pulling on our skills of sympathetically blending liquid. And then you've got the single cask releases, which are, they're pretty purist. They've all got their uniquenesses depending on the cask, but they're unmanipulated, they're not chill filtered, they're not diluted, they just are as they are. Whereas the vatted release, we do play around with the ABV. We fundamentally believe that not all whiskey is at its best directly out of the cask. Indeed, taking it out of the cask, letting it relax a bit, it is often a good thing. People go to distilleries and they'll taste something out the cask and have lots of romantic notions about how amazing it is. But I guarantee you 9 times out of 10, if you try that exact same liquid at home, it doesn't taste quite as good when you're not at the distillery in the warehouse. So with the small batch releases, we do play around between us in the lab to come up with a formulation of cask types and ABVs that we feel show off that amalgamation of casks at their best. And for the time being, I think that's what you can expect from us. Yes, a few surprises, but a mainstay of these small batch releases, getting older, getting bigger, and these single cask releases, which will either be editions for our club members or around the world, as we've seen with the Australian.
Yeah, excellent. There's already a few things in the comments asking for new releases to Australia. I'm sure Scotty's all over it. If he's not, he will be after this. So let's. I want to pour. And Matt, thank you for your time. I know we're going a little bit longer than I said. I only asked you for 2.5 minutes, and you've already gone for an hour. So thank you for that. Appreciate that.
Can't stop me.
Yeah. That's how we like it. We've got the port casks number 39 and 44 at 58.1 and 58.9. So very, very similar whiskies by pure spec. I I'm going to pour them side by side and welcome anyone else to do this. Would you like us to nose these and have a look at them first, or do you want to talk about them first? And
do both. Do both at the same time. I'll witter on, as is my way, and you pour 2 glasses. Suffice to say that they're identical, other than the intricacies of those 2 casks. So this is a really nice comparison point in the same spirit, same cask type. The only differences you're going to get here are the fact that all barrels are individual. It's always nice to do. Everyone likes verticals, getting older and older, but horizontals can be just fun. The port casks are really interesting. They were meant to be released when we did our original single cask releases back at the beginning of 2020. They were meant to sit alongside, you can see them behind me, the green label virgin, the red sherry, and the sort of brown ex-bourbon. The blue port cask was meant to go there. And we tasted them, and they weren't very good at all. So we left them another 6 months, and we tasted them, and they weren't very good at all. And this was baffling, because all the other casks, we could see the development, and it was consistent, and it was somewhat constant, and things were progressing. The port casks weren't really doing anything. So this got us thinking that we needed to look deeper. And so we opened up a cask, and what we discovered was actually the port wine that was left in the barrel. Remembering that whenever you get a barrel into a distillery, you don't want it dry. You do want at least a litre, maybe 2 of liquid inside the barrel. Not because that's going to make any influence on the whiskey. That's like adding a drop into a swimming pool. But because keeping it moist keeps the barrel in its hoops, it keeps it wet and expanded, and it means it's not going to leak. What happened with these port barrels was they'd actually formed about 0.5 centimetre of port residue right round the inside of the crows, around the entire barrel. And what this was doing was effectively creating a sort of gunky barrier between the whiskey and the wood. So the reason why they weren't doing anything was that the whiskey, for all intents and purposes, wasn't in contact with the wood at all. It was protected by this gunky barrier. So knowledge, excellent. We learned something. We tipped them out into IBCs. We scoured them out by hand. I was glad that I wasn't on duty that day. That's a disgusting job. It might smell good, but it isn't good, guys. We recharred them very lightly just to reactivate that wood that was underneath all this gunky port residue, which is sort of mainly skins and leftover sugars. And we put the port wine back in and left it for another year. And this is the result. I mean, when we put the port wine back into the cask, the port whiskey rather, within 2 months, we could tell that it was back on track. Things were happening, and they basically just got stuck. This layer had prevented the natural reaction and the oxygenation which was required for maturation to happen. We left them for an additional year. So yeah, these were meant to come out in 2020, and yeah, quite delayed until earlier this year. And they were the first release this year, a trio of ruby port casks.
Yeah, excellent. That's not the button I was meant to hit. So Simon Agorum pops up with 39 Cherop all the way, and I am being very careful. I've got 39 on the left, 44 on the right, because if I mix this up, I'm going to be talking about the wrong thing. But just from a nose, they are different. There's a real difference to the two of them. That's the beauty and sometimes the frustration with single casks if you're trying to create consistency as well for distilleries like that. But I do get that brighter fruit, whereas 44 for me, at least on the nose, seems a little bit more subtle. It's a little bit calmer. A little bit thing. I mean, Scotty, did you with this stuff coming in? Presumably it's gone in and out. But have you had any feedback on some of these releases from punters and particularly maybe like bars when in that previous life when bars could open in this country?
What's a bar? A bar is what's behind you now. Yeah. Look, I think the majority of people have responded the same way I have. As I've opened a bottle and found it hard not to drink it all very quickly. That's as bigger, I guess, judgment as anything is, what's people's, they don't have to sit there and think about it too much, even though if you want to, you can really have a deep dive on these whiskies, but they're eminently drinkable as well. And particularly this port cask I found, excuse me, was, well, put it this way, I opened I literally got it out of the warehouse as soon as it arrived, took a bottle to a bar that's very friendly, opened it up, put it on the bar. There happened to be a lot of bar people floating through the bar that day, and every single one of them said, please bring me some immediately. So that was the reaction.
Yeah, excellent. I mean, I'm starting to find like almost like cola lollies on the 44. It's got this depth to it, this sort of layered element. But yeah, and then 39 again, that cherry, but that brighter fruit sort of thing as well. I might take a sip of these. So someone else might have to come in here for a second.
Yeah. So I mean, it's always fascinating how you can have two things that on paper are identical, but in reality they're not. We've got quite a few examples of this with even just ex-bourbon casks. Every single one is different. But what I really like is I've never run a tasting yet where we've done a vote or asked people and they've all said, yep, this one was the best, didn't like the other one. And that's really reassuring. I mean, it doesn't bother me which one you like rather than the other. I have my preferences, but it's my palate. But it just reassures me that because everyone likes different things, that makes whiskey a great place. It's the fact that we all have different palates liking different things, which means that whiskey is never boring. If we all like the same thing, whiskey would be a very monolithic and tedious place to be with very few products. So, the fact that these are different is A, the intricacies of wood, but B, just a wonderful part of whiskey maturation, that you can produce something which, they're related, but equally, putting these two together, I'm pretty sure is going to split the audiences. And that you'll find different things. Some are going to be more preferable than others. And it's such a point to cast like side.
I think it's a good point that if the gun was to the head and you needed to choose one to live or die, whichever choice you make is going to be pretty good. There's no wrong choices in this situation. A couple of comments coming through here. 44 is definitely more subtle, but also the more complex. The finish, in particular, is super long. And Dan reckons the 39 is the nose is that real vibrant, but the 44 is huge on the palate. And I'm sort of tending to agree a little bit on this. I'm finding 44 really broad, and that subtlety on the nose is sort of emerging. But the 39 on the palate was just so juicy and jammy. I wrote down there. I couldn't decide whether it was jelly babies or jelly beans, but just like this huge, like quick sweet explosion of flavor that popped through for me, which was really cool. I mean, we're going to keep enjoying these, but what's next? What's in the warehouse? I can see behind you. You mentioned there's a bit of bourbon cask. There's a few other colors that I can see behind your head as I sort of try and do this.
There's all sorts of things up there. That's sort of my. As the person who does all the writing for Bimber, and therefore all the label writing, I'm sort of a little wedded to all these releases. In the sense that they're all a little piece of my heart. What's coming up? So ex-bourbon batch free is coming possibly tomorrow, certainly this week. We have a new product coming out next month, which is sort of Bimber and sort of not. It's called Apogee. It is in direct response to not making enough whiskey, and also wanting to flex our blending skills a bit more. So Apogee is effectively a world whiskey. It's a blended malt, a pure malt that we finished in Bimber barrels. The idea being is that A, we think it's delicious and we're giving it that little flavor by maturing it in our casks. But B, because we've sourced that whiskey, and we're open about that, we're not trying to make ours, because we've sourced that whiskey, it means that it's a product which we can have on our virtual shelves and on stockish shelves, hopefully permanently. So I'm not going to call it a core range because it's not our whiskey, but it's a reflection that we do want to have something out there. We do need to make money. We are planning on moving, not out of London, not too far, but to a site where we can put another pair of stills in, more fermenters in, because if you expand one part of the distillery, you have to expand the other part of it, more cask storage, and a bigger center for people to visit. The short of it, guys, is that we just can't make enough to keep up with demand. I don't think we ever will be. We'll always be that small distillery. But we feel now's the time after, 2 years where the world has been very weird. But it's been pretty good to us. We've had a lot of releases and a lot of love for Bimber, and we really appreciate that. But after 2 years of that, we feel the time's right to expand. So yeah, looking for a new site. Whilst we've done that, we've just got planning permission for a new distillery in Scotland, Dunfale Distillery. It is not Bimber 2. We'll not be producing Bimber there. We will be using some of the lessons learned. So direct fire, long fermentation. But the main difference with Dunfale Distillery, which is Speyside, is we'll actually be operating our own malting floor there, using a kiln and using probably coke to dry our malts. So we're going to be producing it's going to be pretty big and fat, particularly for sort of Speyside standards, a real big, fat, old school Speyside whiskey, which will have substantial meatiness, I imagine, just with those characters. So there's lots and lots of things happening. As we alluded to with Scott for Australian releases, watch the space. We're always chatting to Scott. Things are happening. So more coming your way. And yeah, we would absolutely, definitely love any of your feedback or any of you to visit the distillery, which fortunately after the best part of a year of being closed to the public is now open again. So we're looking forward to seeing you guys both over here, and then when we're back on the road around the world at whiskey shows, we look forward to meeting you there. So lots more whiskey, lots more fun with friends, and hopefully lots more Bimber to come.
Yeah, excellent. Look, I think the future is very, very exciting, and the juice is excellent. It truly is, and I think I don't often say this, but this surpassed expectations of what Scott asked me before we went live and before you jumped on the call today. Matt was like, so Scotty, you've tried all these, haven't you? And I was like, I haven't tried any of them. I had a little sample of something else that I'd tried in the past. 71, I tried a small sample of, but the rest I did absolutely blind. And yeah, thoroughly blown away with just the quality of what's in there, which is excellent.
Thanks,
and to so a big thanks to you for opening up our whiskey forum for tonight. And part of what tonight is this is recorded. There's a lot of people that couldn't make tonight. They're going to watch back later tonight or tomorrow. But this is a bit of a time capsule, and I'm looking forward to doing this in a year, 24 months, in 10 years, and see what was happening and what was going on. So which brings me to my final question, which is not so much about Bimber, but about yourself. You do a few things. You've got your hands in a few pies, but you're obviously really enjoying what you're doing right now. And the Scotland thing, you seem to be quite passionate about. For those that I'm like, how did you personally, Matt, get into Bimber, and where do you see yourself, moving forward?
Sure. So I've been around whiskey.
I don't tell people I'm going to ask this question before I ask it, by the way. So this is proper on the spot stuff.
Yeah, it is a bit. So I've been into whiskey for many years. I'm a whiskey geek. Drink it, festivals, bars. I'm always out and about. And I started quite a few years ago now. I started a website called thedramble.com where I write about whiskey. It's a little different to a lot of whiskey sites. It's not just here's a bottle, here's a distillery history, apples, pears, very nice. There's a lot of writing around the history, economics, social, community, barley, just all sorts of things about whiskey, proving what a geek I am. Anyway, that site grew quite a lot to the point where I was invited over to visit. Thank you guys for that shout. To visit Bimber as an influencer. I hate the word. I don't believe I have influence. I have opinions. Some of them quite strong. I was invited over to Bimber. I'd not been before, which is crazy because it's actually my nearby distillery. I'm northwest London, born and bred, still around here. And they're about half an hour away, so I went in to meet the team. Really impressed by what they were doing there, learning it all, as you guys have been as well, learning it all for the first time. This was before they'd, got their whiskey of age, before 3-year-old whiskey, before the first release. And we were chatting, and they said, well, the one thing that we don't have is any sort of marketing and PR. And we're really looking for, someone who's got those skills, but also knows about whiskey. Would you mind helping us sift through some CVs of agencies and some pictures? So I said, sure, of course I'll help. So I went through some of these pictures, and without naming names, they weren't very good. And there was certainly not a lot of whiskey knowledge there, some great PR, but, they didn't know a blend from a malt, just didn't understand the category. And so I spoke to my wife and I said, you know what? I think I'm going to pitch for this myself. I can do this. And I still have a full-time job. This is the passion job. I work day to day as a PR director in biomedical science publishing. So this is in addition. But yeah, I love it so much. I said, right, I'll pitch for this. Got the job. Been there 2.5 years now. Still loving it. Taking on more and more in terms of, sort of being the spokesperson and face of the distillery, as well as getting involved in, some production and planning decisions. Now we've got a second distillery that we're literally sort of leveling. Darius is up in Scotland, leveling all the ground off, ready for the build. There's a lot to do. So yeah, we'll see what happens. It would be lovely to move into this full time. At some point, yeah, I'm probably going to have to make a decision. Thank you, Simon. It really is that sort of that passion part of my life, whereby your hobby and your skill set, which is years of marketing communication, combined. So no, I absolutely love what I'm doing. That's a sort of very cobbled together history of why I'm sat at my desk.
It's such an excellent story to hear, because we've got such an amazing crew of people watching on now and would normally come to Whiskey Fair, and there's sometimes this fear factor about I'm a punter and their industry, and in whiskey I find that is the lowest possible, because Matt, essentially you're a punter. I absolutely am. I absolutely am. I'm a punter, commentator, and now part of the production cycle as well. And those things fit together wonderfully. It just means that I'm not just here because it's my job. I'm here because it's my life, it's my passion. And so when I'm not doing Bimber things or doing the other job, I'm trying other whiskies and getting all fascinated by what other people are doing and their spins on it. It's a brilliant combination. Yeah, it's exactly what we're trying to recreate with Forum, when we can't all fly into a town together and have this sort of fun and catch up for once a year, to be able to do this and connect with people from overseas who are exactly the same as us. I know a lot of people in the chat, whether they are full-time in whiskey or just lovers of it. It's great fun. So, mate, I'm going to let you go, because I know that we don't have any bars and things to go party at, but we can have another drink. But you have a full day of meetings and things to get to, so I'll let you go. I want to say a huge thank you for your time and your insight and your passion, and your interest to go and visit distilleries and go and say, I can actually do this, because I believe distilleries like this are better and stronger for people like yourselves, because the world's best distiller arguably is not the world's best brand ambassador, and the world's best blender is arguably, not the world's best, financial or distillery accountant. So putting all those pieces together is really, really critical. But thank you so much, and thank you to Scotty as well for piecing all this together and holding on to these bottles for 8 months when I said, no, we are doing it in August. Just bear with me. So both of you, thank you very, very much.
Thanks, Scotty.
Thank you, Scott.
Thanks, Matt.
absolute pleasure to be invited here. Really, it's no trouble at all. It's a highlight of my day. Really appreciate all the interaction, everyone joining in. So again, thank you for your time, and I hope you have a fantastic forum. And yeah, Slàinte enjoy.
Thank you very much. And just before I sign off, there were 3 of the releases that we tried tonight on the website. It was 39 of the port cask, the rechar, and the sherry. So 1, 3, and 4 if you poured 39 before the 44. I haven't checked. I have no idea whether they're still left or not, but they were there about an hour ago. We have all the Australian get-together tastings for next week have been announced today. And tomorrow afternoon, we'll be announcing the grand finale. We know that the Scottish single cask for this year is Ardnamurchan, the first Australian Ardnamurchan single cask to tie in with 65 years and Forum. And we'll be announcing our Australian one tomorrow. It's from Tasmania. And I can't release it because it's embargoed tomorrow, but geez, and Sullivan's Cove, a good distillery. On that note, we will see you all at some other point, and we will talk to you very later. Matt, again, thank you very much, and we'll see you all later.
Cheers, guys. Have a great day.
Good night.